Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have Allison Pincus here with us to talk about experiential learning in law school. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Allison Monahan, and typically I'm here with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have Allison Pincus here with us to talk about experiential learning in law school. Well, welcome, Allison.
Thanks, Allison.
It's so confusing. Well, first off, could you tell us a little bit about your background so people have an idea of where you're coming from?
Yeah, definitely. I went to Berkeley Law School, UC Berkeley School of Law, and I, before that, attended Brown University for college. And in between, I worked for a year at a charter school outside of Boston, and then for 2 years at a civil rights law firm in DC. So by the time I started at Berkeley, I had already had some work experience.
Nice.
And and I think that was kind of part of why I wanted to have some experiential learning during law school, because I'd already been part of the workforce.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some people go to law school and it's like, oh, I just sit in the library. And then you get out and you're like, I have no idea how to talk to a client.
Right, exactly.
So before we get too deep into this, let's just talk a little bit about what we're even talking about. I mean, what are we talking about when we say experiential learning? I mean, I guess in some sense, all learning is experiential, right?
That's true. I think experiential learning in law school means, rather than sitting in a classroom with a professor throwing hypotheticals at you and asking you questions about specific cases that you've read, instead you're getting hands-on experience in, it can be different kinds of settings, direct legal services, or you could be, I know someone that did an externship at SF MoMA, drafting contracts there, and you can do all different kinds of things. But you're in an organization doing legal work and you're having supervision there.
Yeah, so as I understand it, it's basically things like clinics where you are working with an actual client of some type, internships, externships, like you've described, and also these sort of simulation courses. So things like, actually drafting contracts or that type of thing. Sometimes mock trial might even qualify if it's like trial advocacy type things. I guess for me, the distinction is between working with a client and not working with a client. So like the simulation courses, it's set up to give you practical hands-on experience, but you don't have an actual client. Whereas at a clinic, or presumably most externships, you're going to have some type of client that you're actually interacting with.
Exactly.
So anyway, it's basically the things that get you out of the classroom and learn how to actually be a lawyer. So interestingly enough, I didn't really realize this, but the ABA has actually recently increased the amount of experiential learning that you're going to have to do to graduate from law school, which I think is fantastic. So they're requiring 6 credit hours, starting with a class graduating in the spring of 2019. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's great. I learned so much in my clinic and my externship in law school. And when you said you're getting out there and actually seeing what it's like to be a lawyer, it has been kind of surprising that there isn't more of an emphasis, I think, on that in law school, because if you get out there and you haven't had any of these experiences, it can be pretty surprising, I think. And also you just aren't as ready to hit the ground running.
I think that's true. I mean, it's interesting to me because I did a different graduate degree before I went to law school, actually at Berkeley. Right next to the law school, I was in the architecture building. And the pedagogy there could not be more different than the pedagogy in law school, because the whole experience of architecture school is really revolving around your studio course. And in your studio course, what you're basically doing is a project. and you're getting really detailed feedback several times a week from your professors, sometimes more detailed and more feedback than you might want. But, you know, I mean, when I started, we had a class of, say, 25 people, and we had 3 professors. And, you know, they would do an hour-long critique at your desk. And so, you know, that was really where you learned to do architecture. And then at the end, you put it up and presented it to a bunch of people. But it's so different from law school. I mean, I just was always imagining, like, you know, what if all of my classes had been 20 people and the professor really dug into how to do this stuff, which is kind of the part you don't really learn.
Definitely. That emphasis on feedback was something that was so helpful to me in all of the different kinds of experiential learning that I got to do in law school. It makes such a difference. And that does help you hit the ground running, where you know where your strengths are, you know what your weaknesses are, because somebody has paid attention to what you've been doing and has helped you already grow and change.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that's actually even part of the ABA standards for what qualifies as these experiential learning, is that you have to have an opportunity for feedback. So, you know, they recognize, look, this is really important. You have to have the opportunity to try things and then get feedback on them, because, you know, that's kind of how we learn best, I think, anyway.
Right, which is pretty different than, you know, study for an entire semester and then take an exam at the end with little or no feedback through it.
Right. I mean, let's be honest. Most of us never picked up our exams. If we did, they probably didn't have anything other than a few check marks on them. You know, it's not that sort of really detailed, really personalized feedback that is, I think, what, you know, can really move the ball forward on things that you're not so comfortable with. And I mean, even without that, I guess for me, I mean, this isn't exactly experiential learning as it would qualify under these standards, but, you know, I did a decent amount of pro bono work in law school. And, you know, that you definitely realize pretty quickly, like, oh, wow, I really don't know what I'm doing here. But you have to find ways to get better. So that's another thing people can think about. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. So tell me a little bit about the type of experiential learning experiences you personally had in law school.
Sure. My second year of law school, I did a clinic, and I worked in the community lawyering clinic at Berkeley doing direct legal services work, helping clients avoid eviction.
Okay.
And then my third year, I did an externship with the ACLU in San Francisco, doing litigation and policy work. And so my first experience was connected with the law school. It was a different kind of experience because it was direct services rather than a lot of reading and writing, but also it was right at school. It was in the community, but there were people, you know, the lawyers there. I had a meeting every week with my supervisor, which is something that you probably wouldn't get if you were starting out in practice. You might, but it would be less likely because people are really busy once you're practicing.
Sure.
And then the second experience, my externship, I went to the organization in San Francisco, and then we had a weekly seminar at the law school taught by 2 people that were lawyers in the community, but were not part of the ACLU as an organization.
And what do you feel like you got out of these experiences, and how were they the same or different, and what might you have gotten out of them that you didn't necessarily get out of just a class, say, about litigation or something like that?
Sure. So we talked already about feedback and how valuable that is, and the supervision that I received in both experiences. My clinical supervisor and the person that ran the program at the ACLU, they both, you know, their focus was on running the organization at the ACLU and the externship program, and then at the East Bay Community Law Center certainly focus on the clients, but they also were focused on helping me learn, meeting with me, giving me feedback, looking at my writing, making sure that there were other people to look at my work that also worked in the organization. And then they would also have seminars for us and teach us a little bit about the substantive areas of the law that I was working in. So those were both great. So I felt like I had some emphasis on specific skill building as well. In my clinic, I learned how to work with people, that were really different than me and from different backgrounds. I also had the opportunity to practice some negotiation skills because I would be talking a lot with the lawyers who represented landlords, and I was representing tenants who were close to being evicted. And so those were some concrete skills that I got to work on. And I think something nice about it was that I was kind of told these are the skills that you're getting to work on because it was a clinic. They had an emphasis on teaching, and that was interesting. And then at the ACLU, there was a focus on research and writing. I worked with several different lawyers. I got feedback from different lawyers, and my supervisor there facilitated all of that. Mm-hmm. So different kinds of experiences.
And I mean, I assume that you also had summertime legal jobs. Is that right?
I did. Yeah.
How do you feel like this experience was different from that? Because I can see someone listening to this and be like, okay, this sounds great, but like, I'm just going to get experience over the summer. I don't need to be bothered with doing this in law school. Like, there are other things I could take.
Yeah. Well, something that's interesting is that typically, I think when you're in an experiential learning either class or you're working in the community, it's for a certain number of credits, but then you're at the same time, you're also in classes. And there's something interesting about taking classes that are focusing on legal theory and where you're developing your skills, kind of thinking things through and problem solving, which are what some of the black letter law classes teach you to do. And then at the same time, working in the community as a law student and beginning to practice as a lawyer. When you're doing those things at the same time, you can draw some comparisons between what you're learning in the classroom and what you're seeing play out in real life. And that can be interesting.
I think that's right. I mean, I guess for me, because I also did a clinic in law school, which kind of ironically was also about landlord-tenant issues, but the clinic itself was called Lawyering in the Digital Age. And so instead of doing any type of direct representation of a client, it was actually a partner class. So me and my partner, we were working with the head judge of the New York City Housing Court, who was actually very interested in, I mean, as I'm sure you know from your experience, most of the people who show up as tenants in housing court all over the country are not represented. Almost all of the landlords are represented. Obviously this is a huge power imbalance. And, this was interesting because it was coming from the actual chief judge of the court who was saying, look, this is not fair. This is not like, I can't go and hire lawyers for all of these people, but maybe there's some way we can at least facilitate them understanding their rights a little bit better and being on more of a level playing field. So what we ended up really doing was going through essentially all the affirmative defenses and things like that. I mean, I don't know if it's the same in California. I assume it's similar, but, in New York, you could, if you're being evicted, you could come and say, well, look, I haven't had hot water, or there are issues with habitability. Maybe they're rats, maybe they're insects, whatever it is. Frankly, like almost everyone had some sort of defense along these lines. And so the idea was that they would come in and actually go through a very simple checklist that could be translated into multiple languages or whatever, and answer these questions. Does your apartment have this issue? Does your apartment have this issue? Does your apartment have this issue? Hit the button, do a printout, and then at the end, when they go in front of the judge is more able to understand like the full scope of the situation and probably make a better decision. So it was super interesting.
Yeah. We, it was similar in California, and it was also interesting. I mean, I guess this is something that could happen over the summer as well, but if you had learned about those different affirmative defenses in your property law class, and then the next semester you're there kind of seeing it play out on the ground and putting those things into practice, that can also make law school more interesting because you're seeing that some of these things that you discuss are tangible. They're real issues for real people.
I think that's right. And I think it also really opens people's eyes sometimes to the reality of the actual system on the ground. Yes. I mean, it was interesting because a friend of mine was in this same clinic. Everybody was doing different projects, but he was in the same clinic and super libertarian, like very strict about these things. And it actually, he says it was a fundamentally life-changing experience for him to go into this organization. I forgot who he was working with, and really see how these things worked out and realize like, it's not that simple. Like we can't just be like, well, we've got this law that says this, so everything's good. Why worry about it? He said it really actually fundamentally changed his worldview to get this experience of working with these people that he would not have otherwise interacted with in a real life situation.
Right. And what, I mean, when you said, could you go out and do these things over the summer? You could, but there aren't that many opportunities. There are only 2 summers. And so if you're looking to have a lot of different kinds of opportunities to see what kind of environment you want to work in and to see what work you actually like to do, these experiential learning opportunities can be additional ways to see things from new perspectives, try out new areas of the law, and see where you might fit in and what you might like to do after law school.
I think that's right. I mean, for me, I don't know if this was true for you, but I had a lot of trouble deciding what type of clinic I wanted to do. So, I mean, it's ironic because now it seems really obvious. Like, I was a programmer before law school. Like, now I work in sort of like legal, digital tech stuff. Everyone's like, of course you did that clinic. But it really, I was deciding between that and 3 other options that all seemed pretty good.
Yeah. I had worked at a civil rights firm that did a lot of fair housing impact litigation. And I knew I was interested in housing. So eviction defense made sense for me. But it was also great to work on an area that I cared about, but in a very different way because I was doing direct services this time instead of impact litigation. And I think when students are trying to figure out how to navigate all the different options, there are a couple of different things to focus on. One is, is there an issue area that you're passionate about? And it seems like that guided both of our decisions.
Right.
But then there's also what skills are you looking to develop, and have you heard anything, in the same way you hear about different professors, and some professors that are superstars, there can also be amazing supervisors. There was one at Berkeley that everybody talked about. She was just incredible. And maybe you haven't had great supervision before, or you have and you want more of it. You want more of that feedback. So those are some different ways that you can think about the next opportunity that you want to try to get.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if people are listening to this and they're saying, oh, this sounds great, I'm interested in finding out more about my opportunities. I mean, I think the fact that now this is a requirement is really going to force schools to offer more opportunities, which is fantastic.
Right.
Because I know, I think for a lot of people, particularly 2Ls, where I went to school, it was sort of frustrating because they couldn't necessarily get into the clinic they wanted to do. And then it becomes this thing of, well, do you try to wait for the 3rd year when you're going to have higher priority, but maybe then you still don't get into it. So it was always, there's always going to be, I guess, ones that are oversubscribed. But I think people do need to really, kind of figure out what the options are and think about what seems appealing to you. Do you want to work directly with clients? Do you not want to? I mean, those are both fair choices. And what type of clients? Who do you want to be interacting with? Who do you want to be helping out? And I think your point about what kind of skills you want to develop is a really good one. For me, for example, I kind of wish now that I'd taken some simulation type class on contract drafting in law school, because I hated contracts as a subject. And I was like, I don't want anything to do with this. But now you realize that's actually a real life skill.
And learning about the theory can be very different than actually working on drafting contracts.
Yes. I think like of all the things law school theoretically should have prepared me for, like drafting contracts is probably one of them. I don't know. What are some other skills I'm thinking of? Like interview skills, I think, are really fundamental.
Definitely. I took a class, interview skills, so important. I took a class on a whole semester negotiations class, and that was incredible. And it wasn't a full clinic, but it was we broke into groups every week. We had different partners. We learned what our negotiation styles were, and everyone uses negotiation in some way or another. So it was really helpful to just feel more comfortable with that, because everyone has to do it, but not everyone feels comfortable. So that was great.
Yeah, I think that's another really key one that I wish I had developed a little bit more in law school. A friend of mine who did do the negotiations class at Columbia actually gave me a book. I'm sure you probably read it too. I don't remember what it was. It was kind of like the Bible of negotiations. Yes. And I actually read it later because I thought, this is something that I missed the boat on. Like I really should have taken this class and had that experience. Do you think... I guess if you had to pick your favorite out of all those different experiences, you've done the clinic with direct services, you've done the externship, you've done some simulation type things. What did you like best?
Yeah, that is a good question. It's interesting too, because my clinic was so well run and I learned so much there. Direct legal services work is really hard. So that it probably was my favorite, but it also just took so much out of me because I was learning a lot and I was also working directly with clients for the first time. So it was a great learning opportunity. It was hard work. And so the negotiations class, I also really enjoyed. It felt like that came pretty naturally. But it just didn't feel as draining as I was learning how to do that. So I liked both of those, but for very different reasons.
And I think actually what you say about the intensity of the clinic experience is actually a really good point for people to keep in mind. I mean, yeah, it sounds like my clinic was not quite as intense as yours, but I think a lot of them are really, really intense. And I think for a lot of people that can be probably their most intense semester of law school.
Right.
And I think people need to really consider what other classes they're taking.
Definitely, definitely. And so, I mean, experiential learning is great, but and you want to be able to really focus and have the energy to bring to the work that you're doing. And so you want to balance out the other classes that you're taking. Part of that can be maybe you take 2 black letter law classes and they're challenging in different ways, and you have to really prepare for those too. But you wouldn't want to be doing a skills class and experiential learning necessary, and a clinic or an externship necessarily, because it might just be too much time or it might be too draining. And so balancing your course load is really important.
Right. I'm thinking you probably don't want to take Fed courts that semester, or these other classes that are like really intellectually demanding as well, just because, you're not going to do as well in any of them and you're not going to get as much out of the experience. I think, that semester or whatever that you're doing the clinic or you're doing the externship, it's just important to be realistic about your time and your commitments so that you do get the most out of it.
Right.
Because, I mean, the reality is, particularly if you're working in direct legal services, you have real responsibilities. People are depending on you.
Definitely.
So what was that experience like, having that experience for the first time?
It felt really good. I mean, that was why I had gone to law school, to try to be useful to people. And so it was great to feel like I was doing that and to actually see the people that I was working with and working on behalf of. And even though in the beginning it was draining because it was so different than being in these theoretical classes, by the end it was incredibly rewarding, as I felt like I knew what I was doing more and I saw that I was actually able to help people. And then at the same time, I had the safety net of an incredible supervisor who was watching over the work that I was doing, and I had responsibility, but then I also had someone that was helping me make sure I got things right.
I think that's critical. I mean, I think back to, I took on a bunch of pro bono cases my first semester in law school, which in retrospect maybe wasn't the greatest idea. I mean, it was great in one sense because it did really give me that feeling of like, I can do something to help someone, and that was great. But at the same time, I mean, to be honest, it wasn't really that supervised. And obviously I had no idea what I was doing because I'd been in law school like 3 weeks or something at that point.
Right.
There were definitely these moments of, I am 100% not qualified to answer the questions that this person is asking me.
Yeah, that can be scary.
It was definitely scary. I mean, on the other hand, it did make me realize, like, okay, even though I don't know the answer, at least I do have resources. But I think that's one of the benefits of doing this sort of work in more of a clinical setting or an externship, is that you do have these people, besides just the pro bono supervisor who may or may not be around, who can actually walk you through like a difficult issue, or sometimes frankly like ethical issues come up in a lot of these situations that you may not really be totally prepared to handle.
Definitely. And you also have other students that are going through something similar, and the environment is one in which you're not expected to know all the answers. And so when you don't, you can ask and you can feel comfortable doing that. And there are other people there that are in the same boat as you. And that creates a nice environment for being able to learn and being able to help people too.
And did you find in the clinic setting where it's only really a few months, were you able, how did that work? Like, did you have your own clients? Did you take a case from end to end? Like, how was it?
In California, at least, eviction defense cases move really quickly. So I did get to see a lot of my cases from start to finish. It's not like impact litigation where you're working on a case for several years before the conclusion. So that was nice to be able to be really involved. I think I went maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and my supervisor, if things came up on my cases that were urgent when I wasn't there, my supervisor would handle them. But otherwise, I would meet with a client, I would be working with that person, I would do any research or writing that needed to be done. I went to court a few times, although I couldn't appear in court, and so my supervisor would handle those pieces for me. But I was definitely very involved in the cases, knew what was going on in them. And I felt like they were my cases for sure.
Right. No, I think that's super interesting. And I mean, in terms of the clinic, different types of experiences. So you've got the direct legal services, which, literally you and the client, solving their problem, hopefully. And then you also mentioned impact litigation. So what do you mean by that?
So, for example, in the work that I did before law school, I was a paralegal, but I worked for a civil rights firm. They focused on fair housing law, and the firm would take cases with the goal of certainly helping individuals that they were representing if they had an issue, they had been discriminated against. But then they also were looking at the law kind of as a whole in fair housing and trying to make sure that the laws were fair and changing them if necessary.
Yeah, so I think that's a key point to think about when you're considering what type of clinic you might be interested in. I know at my school, for example, there was a really well-regarded environmental clinic. And so they would I think they would do these cases that might go on for years, and each, saying, some sort of impact litigation involving the environment. And so, it was a different experience to kind of jump into the middle of a case like that and maybe just do one piece for a few months versus having a client that you see from it beginning to their case to the end. And neither one of them is better or worse. It's just a question of which do you think would be the best fit for what the experience you're looking for. And you've got cases that do appellate, or clinics that do appellate cases sometimes and things like that. There are all these different options. I think really considering, what are you trying to get out of it? What are your interests? How might this position you for a job? That type of thing. That can be really critical, but you can also just do one because it seems kind of fun, which is sort of what I did.
Definitely. You can learn about a new area of the law that you didn't know anything about before, or you can, exactly as you said, be kind of thinking about what might be coming next and getting to know, that's another thing, you get to know your supervisors really well, and they probably later can speak to the work that you've done in a different way than when you're sitting in class answering questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked with one of our tutoring students who was really interested in doing appellate work, and he managed over the course of several externships and clinics and that kind of thing to really position himself as someone who had a portfolio in that area. He hasn't quite gotten that job yet, but he's only a year out of school. So, I have no doubt that he has positioned himself to at least have a shot at getting that type of job in a way that he probably wouldn't if he had not had that practical experience.
Right. And especially in public interest organizations where there aren't as many resources to be able to train new lawyers, if you come in and you've already had some of those experiences, that can be really helpful, when you're looking for a job too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Something was going on in the background there. Seems to have stopped.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're almost about out of time, but do you have any tips for people if they don't immediately get into their first choice clinic or externship? I know in a lot of cases you do have to apply for these. They can be very competitive. What should people do?
Sure. One thing is if you haven't waited until your last semester, the spring of 3L year, you certainly can apply for a second time. And something that is great, as we've said about these clinics and externships, is that they're very feedback and teaching oriented. And so I wouldn't be afraid to ask for feedback after you've applied and say to whoever it is that's choosing students, is there something missing from my resume that would be helpful background experience for me to have before I'm in the clinic? Hopefully, you don't want to have too much experience already because the point is to learn, but maybe there's something that they're looking for that you could do, not necessarily in a semester-long course, but pro bono work, or take a class that you have a little bit of background, and then you're a more attractive candidate for the clinic.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think applying the second time obviously makes it look like you're more serious. Talking to the people who are in charge of it, just saying, hey, I really, truly am very interested in this. Just want to let you know that. And I think your advice on asking for a way to become a stronger candidate is great. Maybe there's just one class. They're like, oh, we'd feel a lot more confident, letting you do this if you'd taken evidence. It's like, okay, go take evidence. Done.
Exactly.
Problem solved. Good thing you asked.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you can do too much experiential learning in law school? This all sounds awesome. I just want to do some briefs, do some negotiations, have some clients.
I think I think experiential learning is great. I did a lot of it between the clinic externship and then a couple of hands-on classes. I guess you do want to be taking these other kinds of classes that train you to think in a certain way. And it's also important to have a basic understanding of different areas of law. So a balance is good. You also, I guess, want to be preparing for the bar exam. So there's, not necessarily too much throughout law school, but there are some courses that you can take to help with that as well. So it is a balance. And then, as we said earlier, that these experiential learning opportunities are very demanding of your time and your energy. And so when you're focusing on those, you really want to be able to focus, and you might not be able to sustain that all throughout law school doing it all the time. So there's that balance as well.
I think that's right. I mean, clearly it's a balance. You can't just totally blow off every doctrinal class because you think this sounds more fun. And it's like, sorry, there are a few things you probably need to know before you get out of law school.
Yeah.
Well, Allison, thanks so much for joining us. Any final thoughts on this topic?
I think we talked a little bit about trying out a new area. That sounds good. Maybe taking a risk, whether it be a new area of the law that sounds interesting or building a new skill. A clinic or an externship or a class where you have an opportunity to really practice something can be great, and being able to do it for a relatively short amount of time, just take a risk and go for it, because the payoff can be huge.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you really hate it, it's only a few months of your life. You'll survive. All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app, because we would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Typically, our episodes are out on Monday. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Lee at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or Allison at lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at, you guessed it, lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.